Oh, hello guys. Today we will have a look at the SDC controllers and namely the SDC graphic series controllers, SDC-20G and 32G. Many of you guys have been asking if we can actually store historical log data inside the controllers, and the simple answer is yes. We can use something called the SQL database inside the controller. We believe the Sedona controllers, the graphic series, are pretty much unique in the world, that we have this SQL database in a controller stored on a SD card on the controllers. The SD card can be up to 16 gigabytes. What is the SQL database? You may wonder what it is. It's just the way of storing effectively historical data. So what we can do is maybe humidities, temperatures, switching values, NEAT readings, CO2 readings, and so on. We can store that on a database on the controller, and then we can access that data. The data is available using HTTP request to Excel spreadsheets and other software packages, or it is available for the web page on a web graphic. So let's have a look at what do we mean by that. So if I just bring an example here, is I have a controller connected, SDC-20G controller on a system. I have created some graphics pages, and you saw that on the previous sessions what we had, but we have this something called trend graphs. If I click the trend graph page, this is now basically showing on the web browser the data from the system, from the SD card, and I can select different ranges and different days. I only was have been logging for a while the data on this controller for a couple of parameters called ramp curve and outside air temperature. So how is this achieved? We use the CPT tool. I have a shortcut for the CPT tool here. If I double click that, that opens the CPT tool, and on the bottom I have buttons to connect to the SDC-20G controller. So if I click the IP address 192.168.2.11, which is the address for the Sedona 20G as default, and press OK, then that takes me into the controller. Actually, the default address is 192.168.10.11, but I have changed it to 2.11. So what we see here now on the left-hand side, as you may remember, the tree structure of the older folders, and then we have a graphics pages here. And if I double-click the trend page, this is actually the trend graph that we are displaying on the web page, and the values are stored on this page called trend. So let's say if we wanted to start this from scratch, so I go to the trend page, and I'm just gonna delete that trend graph, and on the programming page, I save the page. I want to delete everything to do with the historical logging using a SQL database. So I have nothing configured in a controller at the moment regarding the SQL database. So first thing to do when you want to log the historical data on a SQL database, you have to load the SQL database historical logging kit, the application library. So what we need to do is to go to the kit management, and you have to tick this object called EasyIO FG SQL kit. You tick that and you apply. That basically loads the FG SQL data functionality into the controller, so we can then start utilizing the SD card, and we can start storing data on the SD card. After loading, it will do the cold start, and we need to logging into the controller again. So we click the 192.168.2.11 and off we go. So we are inside the controller now, and we have loaded now a kit called FG SQL on the left hand side. You may remember we use all these libraries and kits for the programming. So if we now wanted to create this trend page, what we do is you could create that anywhere in your system. But what I want to do is that if we have multiple pages here for the program, as you previously have seen, I may want to create another folder for the clarity for the historical logging. So if I right click on here on the top of the SDC-20G and click add folder. Now we have added folder, so if I just minimize those, and for the folder name I call it the trend. Okay, so we have a historical trend folder there now. You see there is a asterisk, little asterisk here. This means that we are working on the RAM memory of the SDC-20G, 32G controllers, and we must remember to press the save button in order to actually to save application to non-volatile memory. Why? If you unplug the power any time, and if you haven't pressed the save button, you lose everything what you have been doing the programming. It's exactly the same as in a computer. If you work on a Word and you don't save it and power down the computer, you will lose what you've done. So remember to press the save button, okay? So that's the most important thing to remember on any programming on the on SDC controllers. So we created now this folder called trend. Double click that and we have nothing here. So what we need to do is to first we need to load something called the SQL service. So we drag and drop from the IOFG SQL database to SQL service, and there's nothing else to do than then load the table. You can have a multiple tables on your SQL database. So I drag and drop the table object on the top of that SQL server service object, and you can see that there is a SQL table now. And if I double click the SQL database object, I can see that's where I have it. So what I need to do next is to give a name for the table. So you need to go here area called the table name buffer on the properties. So in that I give it just simple name data. You could call it whatever you want it to be called. You also will need to enable it. So you need to enable the table, and that's what you need to do. Then you have another options here is a record type. You can do COV, which is change of value, interval, or interval on hour. So we can, for example, set it up on the once a minute if I set up the interval. And then we also have the maximum number of records. Currently you can store for each of the tables 100,000 samples, but you could use a multiple tables. So then we have created a SQL database table where we store the information. So now if we want to start logging some values, let's say that I want to get some ramp values and the temperature values to the historical database, I just go inside the SQL table, and now from the FG SQL kit we're going to drag and drop the right type of the objects. So typically you would use the SQL boolean, which are on-off values, SQL float, decimal point values, and the SQL integers, which are integer values. So in this case I'm just going to grab a couple of floats, okay? And if I highlight the first float, I call it as a ramp, and then I'm going to give it the name a ramp as well. The column name is the one field that is actually stored on the SQL database, and you must remember that for the graphics pages, so you need to use that. COV value here is that if you set it up the tables to work on a COVs, you could change that when the value changes more than a 0.5, then it will store the value in there. If it's an interval or logging, it doesn't affect. And then we have another value called temperature, so I'm just going to call it temperature, and the column name I'm calling it temperature as well. So that's again the column where we're going to use them. There are no values here at the moment, so what we need to do is that we need to link that somewhere on your logic. So we want to log the ramp value and the temperature. You may have remember, if I go to the on SDC-XG folder, I have some ramps here. So I have a ramp on the bottom here, just ramping up and down, giving some values, and I happen to have an outside air temperature here as well, which is in fact there is another temperature here, is a flow temperature, which is linked to a simulator on the controller. So I have a little potentiometer connected to the controller, so we can actually change up and down the temperature values. So what I do is I just highlight, let's say, that flow temperature, and then go to on the top of the link builder, make link, and it pops up the area where we can link the value, the output of the flow object. So we take the output of the flow object on a trend, historical trending, to the temperature and in. You can see that. So we link the flow output to the temperature in and click the link button in the middle. And at the same time we can go back and say, let's say I wanted the ramp2 value. So I go to the ramp2 and I take the output of that and I take the ramp object on a SQL database, take that in, link and close. So if I now go to the SQL database, you have a little dots here indicating that they are linked to somewhere. In fact, if you highlight the object on the bottom right hand side, you can see something called links and it tells you where the values are coming. So if you ever wondering where are those values coming into the graphics. So what you now can do is that on the SQL table, you can right click here and you have actions. So first of all you need to do sync structure, and then what you need to do actions update structure. So you need to do both of those in order to get it the SQL database going. So if I now go to inside the SQL database object, so sorry, if I go to inside the SQL table here and click the properties on the right hand side, you can see that that has been set up. It's storing the data. It's already stored 89 values here. The current record is 89 values. So now this data is available to the use by either the web browser application or getting the data out from the system. So now if I wanted to do graphics for that, what we need to do is to go to the graphic page and let's say we right click and say we create a trend graphic page. So we get call it a new trend. There you are. So we have a blank page. So if I go to the blank page, I can first of all maybe give us some header for that. So we go to general and I just go to do the label object and I call it trend history. On the right hand side you have the properties. As you remember, when you go to graphics page, these change to library, the graphics widgets on the bottom left, and then we can see the properties. So I can just make it slightly bigger track and maybe just to change the font information, the size of the font for example, and make it bold. So trend history. And how do we actually then read the data from the SQL database, from these data that we are storing here to the graphic page? Well, it's quite straightforward. We have an object called history line chart, and we can just drag and drop the history line chart to the page, and on the right hand side we have a properties. So what we need to do is to first give a table name. This one is called data. This must match the one which you given here, the SQL database name on the table name here, otherwise you will not get the data. Then you need to have the column name. Again, these must match what you have configured inside the controller. In this case what we have is a ramp and we have a temperature. We want to give, or maybe for the user as well, some more information, so we can put like a legends. So we have a ramp value and then we have a temp value. So these are the values what we show for the user, and we have now configured the widgets. So what we do now is to click the save button, and now on here on the top what we're gonna do is a deploy. So we're deploying that to the controller. It's ask the username, web user, password is 123456 if you have to enter that. So press OK. That is now loading the changes into the controller. And if I bring now back to the controller, let's go back to the controller. So we go here, just go to the controller, and you can bypass this menu by ticking an option on the CPD tool. But if I click CPD graphics, that takes now me back to the CPD graphics page, and you can see there is on the navigation tree there is a new object called the new trends. So if I click the new trend object, that is now loading my historical data from the controller to here. So this is as simple it is to actually to store the historical data in a SD card on the SDC-20G and 32G controllers, and how to use the trend widgets, historical trend widget, to actually read the data to the web page.